Richard Steele. I'm the CEO of the Carl Koenig Institute, which has an office in Berlin and an office in America, in Hudson, New York, and an office in Scotland at the moment. So, what I want to talk about is the Camphill Movement. And Carl Koenig was the founder of the Camphill Movement. So, out of what did he found the Camphill Movement? And I would like to just remind us of this very special year that Rudolf Steiner had, this basically last year of his the unfolding of these mysteries after the Christmas Foundation meeting. All that he could give in this year, 1924, also into 25, of course, was quite exceptional. And one of these things was curative education. And I'm astounded again and again to remember that, in actual fact, this wonderful course he gave on curative education was, outwardly speaking, given for three young people who began with curative education in the eastern part of Germany in 1924. And they asked him for help, and he was so keen to do this. He traveled directly from the agricultural course in Kobowitz to see the children that these people were working with, to give them advice. And out of that came then 1924, the curative course. It is quite special. And it is, in actual fact, let us say, a book of schooling into reincarnation and karma. That is the underlying theme that goes through all these lectures. How do we observe the human being, human nature, human difficulties in order to find a path towards the situation of incarnation of the individual and be able to heal, to help this path of incarnation according to karma? It's something very special. And of course, we can't imagine that this course was given for three young people. It was, of course, given very strongly towards the future. And I very much believe that we're just beginning with this future now, at a point where all that is developed out of the curative course, the curative education centers across the world, the social therapy centers, the village communities, what they are called all over the place, the workshops that have been set up for people with special needs, and so on and so forth. That is in a very difficult situation all at the moment across the world, particularly in Europe and America. Huge challenges to what has been developed over the decades. We can practically say over 100 years. And there we sit at this point now, and I think that's the reason we are together this evening. That's the reason for celebrating 100 years of Rudolf Steiner, because 100 is the beginning of a new phase. It is 3 times 33 and a third. And after this 3 times 33 and a third, something new can arise. We can reconnect to this original impulse in a new way. And I really believe this is what needs to happen, particularly with this curative impulse. Leave it at that at the moment, a curative impulse. Of course, there was the unfolding of anthroposophical medicine at the same time, education, of course, the Christian community, so much that was happening, as I say, agriculture, of course. And in the center of all this little seed, these three young people, who, by the way, didn't necessarily get on with each other so very well. And so this little seed that Rudolf Steiner visited in Jena didn't live on so very long physically. But a movement evolved out of this, which has come now over 100 years to this very particular point of today, where I think everyone working in this field realizes something new needs to take place. We need a new perspective. And that is where Karl Koenig comes in for my experience, because Karl Koenig was one of these, not one of the three, but one of these pioneers who helped to start one of the first centers for curative education in Germany, and went into all these difficulties that arose immediately, of course. It was the beginnings of National Socialism. It was the beginnings of the dangers towards anyone who was different in any way. Um, I, I'm very careful what I say, of course, at the moment, but you can see how strongly that connects to where we stand today, in today's world. The dangers were there, and right at the beginning of the unfolding of this curative work. And I think we can't understand it any different that Rudolf Steiner knew this seed would have to be there, because with certainly at the latest 1933, not only is a new connection to the Christ being coming about, not only is a new connection to the etheric world, but it is this depth of danger and destruction which appeared at the same time. The sun demon reared its head exactly in this time. And I do think that Rudolf Steiner gave this seed of curative education exactly because of this. Not so that we have wonderful institutions today. We do have wonderful institutions, that's great. But we need now to make a new step and realize what Rudolf Steiner initiated with this little seed. And many of you know, of course, that let's say the central point of this curative course, the inner work for curative education, was this wonderful meditation of point and circumference. And I don't want to talk about that too much. Many of you know it. Otherwise, please get hold of the curative course and take a look, because this central, we could say, specific meditation for curative education. But I think we have to realize this meditation can be very central today for the situation we are all facing. Because this symbol of the point and the circumference is, of course, the symbol of the being of the sun. And is this being that one needed to connect to for any sort of healing, of course, particularly curative education. And it is the being which we need to incorporate into our life today in a very particular way. So when Karl Koenig actually, through the outer circumstances, one has to say, through the karmic situation, he came out of a Jewish family. He was working with anthroposophy. That was already no longer allowed in Central Europe. Yeah. He was working with children who were already being murdered by the National Socialists. A completely impossible situation. He, by the way, had a little handicap of his own, but that's beside the point at the moment. He was someone who suffered greatly, very personally, out of this karmic situation of the rise of National Socialism. And at the same time, and I think that's important to realize right now in this year, at the same time, it was not only the outer attack of National Socialism, everything that was happening politically, not only in Central Europe, but across the world, which was challenging the new spiritual movement, but it was from within that actually the greatest tragedy for the Anthroposophical Society actually happened. Exactly the same time, we could say, 1935, when Ita Wegman, who was the founder of this healing impulse, or the carrier of this healing impulse of anthroposophy, was excommunicated, one should say, out of the Anthroposophical Society. Also, Karl Koenig, 1935. Just imagine, exactly the same time as this outer catastrophe takes place, point and circumference. From the inside, this tragedy begins to show itself. It was not completely new, but it begins to show itself. And of course, it is mainly a karmic tragedy. So you see how already with this year 1924 and the following years, we have this little seed of point and circumference that begins to show its reality, its necessity very, very soon when the anthroposophical curative movement is growing across the world in the 30s and 40s, and of course, through huge difficulties. Also, Karl Koenig had to immigrate. He had to move to the north of Scotland to be able to work at all. He was no longer allowed to be a doctor. He was no longer allowed to speak publicly, and so on and so forth. I don't need to go into the details. But what he began with the Camphill movement in Scotland, first of all, which then spread out across the world until today, it's still spreading into African countries, into the East, and so on and so forth, was actually nothing new. And I'm sure Karl Koenig would find it important to say today, he didn't bring anything new. He tried to bring something which was very centrally anthroposophy, and nothing but central anthroposophy. He brought no, let's say, content of his own. And yet, he was one of the very first pioneers of anthroposophy, one of the first who actually never met Rudolf Steiner. It's also important. But I think we can see how he tried to develop with the Camphill movement this also a seed for the future. He was very keen on this image of the seed, not that he'd already accomplished something, but that he knew it needed to be there for the future. And this seed was nothing else but a situation, a living situation where anthroposophy could live in every level of being. From the inner work of the individual right into every aspect of outer life. I like to call it a holistic experiment in anthroposophy. And so the Camphill movement was actually not really just a development of curative education, social therapy, as it was developing across the world, but it was the attempt to find a living situation somewhere, because Central Europe was being destroyed, also anthroposophically, that he needed to find a space where this seed of anthroposophy could live in every level of life. Holistic, curative situation. Curative, yes, of course, because people with special needs need curative work. But he saw, of course, that it was not only individuals with their specific needs, but that the human race was in need and would be in even greater need in the future. So this would be a very big theme to look at. But his hope for the Camphill movement was it would not remain a movement for curative education and social therapy to look after specific special needs in society, not to build schools with special education or village communities with workshops. Yes, wonderful, as the ground for something much, much larger and more important for the future, because humanity is in need of this healing impulse. We see it in education, everywhere, that more and more we need to turn to special needs because every human being brings special needs. And our world is living in a situation of special need, more and more. So this impulse that Karl Koenig wanted to lay as a seed into the north of Scotland, first of all, and then to hope that it would grow across the world, was something which was thought of as something much more than just curative education. And towards the end of his life, he gave a few indications of the fact that this he called it this mood, this way of life would need to be developed for the future, for those who are refugees, for those who are left behind by a society in whichever way, for elders, for anyone who has a special need. And so the Camphill Movement has taken on various aspects of this work, but we are very much in the beginning and begin to see, I think, how anthroposophy needs for the future to live, as Karl Koenig put it, particularly from one to the other. He spoke of the encounter of I with I. Not I to I, but I with I. So with the self of one to the self of the other. That is where he saw this seed evolving for anthroposophy of the future as a healing impulse. And I think we can realize that not only the tragedies of history, the tragedy of the Anthroposophical Society at the time, but the tragedy of our time needs a healing impulse, needs anthroposophy as healing impulse. And so this holistic situation that Koenig tried to build during the Second World War in the north of Scotland was also he also called it an experiment for the future, where something could begin to show itself as a way of allowing anthroposophy to heal the contact from one human being to the other. So, as I say, one could say very much about this, but we can see how important it is today, I think, when the word of inclusion becomes so very important. We talk about including people with special needs. I think we have to be aware that we need to include every human being, not just people who have specific special needs, but every human being has a special need to become individuality. That is a special need. And so these people who we have called people with special needs in the past need more and more to become our teachers. That was what Karl Koenig began, that the person with special needs was in actual fact a teacher for humanity of the future, to teach us to help each other, to be teachers of love from one human being to the other. And in actual fact, we can say, in addition to the medical movement, where we can deal with substances, we are in curative work the substance ourselves. That is the point of this sun meditation, that the person in curative education or in social therapy has to be aware of the needs of the other, because I need to be the healing of the other. And this, of course, has huge connotations for the future of humanity, I think, because it is no longer a little settlement. You showed this closed gate with a little settlement. No, that's not what it's about for the future. We have to find how the seed for holistic healing from one to the other can actually become something for humanity. So let me just say, I think, of course, the Camphill movement is worrying in all corners of the world, particularly in Europe, also in America. How will this continue? Will it be allowed to continue? Of course it will. It must, because it's needed. And I think we need to see that we are passing through this eye of the needle at the moment to a very new step, which is of huge need for the future. So 100 years is the end of something, but it is actually the very beginning of something which is much greater, and I think which Rudolf Steiner intended with this meditation of point and circumference. And in actual fact, at the end of this curative course, just to remind you of this, he indicated how important curative education would be for, I put it into my words, for the healing of the sections of the Anthroposophical Society. It would be, so to speak, the central activity to bind the various sections together. Now, I don't want to say any more about this, just to indicate that that is in the curative course, and it is something which was very, very close to Karl Koenig's heart for the Camphill movement. And so much so that these two personalities, Karl Koenig and Rudolf Steiner, passed the threshold of death at the same time according to the calendar of the soul. It was a different week, it was a different year, and yet the same verse was, so to speak, being read when they both passed the threshold. I think that's quite interesting to see. It means something, I think. And certainly Karl Koenig saw himself as a very close pupil of Rudolf Steiner and hoping to point society to Rudolf Steiner, not to Karl Koenig, but to Rudolf Steiner. So we have this verse 51 is actually the verse into which both of these individualities passed into the spirit world. Into the innermost human realm, the wealth of senses pours itself. Thank you, Andrew. Yes, the wealth of senses pours itself. World spirit finds reflection in the mirror of the human eye, which needs thence to recreate its power. Quite a difficult verse to understand, but I think very, very significant, pointing to the task of the individual in our time. So that is the birth of death of both of these individualities. Thank you.